afterwards, I usually do a little housekeeping. The restrooms, everyone's familiar with the Orris, so they're in both quarters back there. So that'll work for you. Members, how many are members of the St. Genevieve Museum Learning Center? Quite a few, very good. Well, I'll tell you, if you pay for admission tonight, and you are not a member, you can apply tonight's admission to your membership. So, woo, yeah, that'd be good. So, I'm not sure how we do that. We usually tell people go down to the gift shop after the program. So, but everyone will be on their honor system. So, if you attended tonight's presentation and you'd like to apply tonight's admission to a membership, feel free to stop in at the gift shop anytime, and we'll warrant that. So. Let's see, what else do we have here? You know, the museum is sponsored by memberships and also admissions, a few grants here and there, not nearly as many as we would like. Gift shop sales, we got some really neat stuff in the gift shop, by the way. If you haven't had a chance to peruse there lately, we've got some neat stuff. And the generosity of donors and sponsors, like tonight's program, which is sponsored by Southbound Fuel, Bob and Denise Greasehaver. I think they're here. They here? Yeah, let's give them a hand. It's very generous of them to sponsor tonight's program. So we are not tax supported in any way, so we rely on the generosity of people to help out at the museum, so that's wonderful. A few other things to talk about, and I think I need my glasses on. Oh, much better. I'll tell you. Let's see. If any of you know of any homeschoolers, we've got a great program letting our homeschoolers take part in our homeschool junior paleontologist lesson series. Kind of cool. And they can get their own paleontology ranger badge through the museum and the National Park Service. So that's kind of neat. So, and they don't have to attend every single session. They can attend just a few or what have you. So you can just call the museum anytime and find out a few more details on that. Night at the Museum raffle. Now this is pretty cool, and if you don't take advantage of this, by golly, there's something wrong. Because it's an easy thing. You can be the hit of your family, your kids can be the hit of the school, because for a mere raffle ticket, and I'll tell you how much that is in a minute, you can have 25 of your friends come to the museum for a docent-led tour, upstairs and downstairs, a pizza dinner, and a movie for 25 people. All for only, drum roll, anybody? $5 a ticket. $5 a ticket. That's it. And you could win all those things and be the hit of your family. Wouldn't that be a neat Christmas gift? You have a year to take advantage to claim your prize. So all you have to do is stop at the gift shop anytime. We're open 7 days a week. And the drawing will be held on November 27th. So you want to be sure and get your ticket and or tickets by November 27th. So that's kind of cool. That's Night at the Museum raffle. So, and since Christmas is on the horizon, let me remind you that we make puzzles. How many knew we make puzzles? Anyone know? Yeah. You can get your picture taken on the Camarasaurus and the, no, you can't be on the Camarasaurus. Like our skeleton. How many have seen our skeleton on the Camarasaurus in the Hall of Giants? Well, you'll all just have to go and see that, which is another perk of your membership. You can visit the museum at any time, and you can see that dinosaur with the Camarasaurus on its back, or with the skeleton on its back. We have a new World War II exhibit that our Fred Darrow, our exhibit guy extraordinaire. Fred, you want to tell him a couple words about the exhibit?
Well, yeah, in the corner of the museum, we've got a new wine garden display that's going in. So there's a new case that I just got done with, and it has artifacts in there. All the gear that a D-Day soldier would have had on in that morning when they stormed the beaches. So that's new. We got some art that's going on the wall. We've got some relics. You've probably seen some of them sitting on the table right where we left from. I didn't bring them over here. But some relics that were artwork that the prisoners had done. And so that goes in another display case that's going to go on the wall.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty cool, so you have to take advantage of that and come see it. Speaker presentations, which is what we have here tonight. We got a few coming up that might be of interest to you. Coming up on November the 13th at 7 o'clock, we have a presentation on the Tuskegee Airmen. So this will be quite interesting too. Marcy Whitley, the daughter of an original Tuskegee Airman, will be our guest speaker, and she's going to talk about the history of the airmen, the Red Tails as they were known, and their importance in setting the stage for the integration of all men in the U.S. military. And by the way, that's going to be right after Veterans Day. So on the 11th, November 11th, we invite all members as well as veterans to come see the critically acclaimed movie Red Tails in our presentation room for free. So we certainly invite that. That will be on November 11th at 3:30 p.m. on that day. So we invite again members and veterans to come. On December 11th, we'll welcome Bill Naggard. Who doesn't know Bill Naggard? He's going to have some fantastic photos and memorabilia from the St. Genevieve Bicentennial. So that's always of interest to a lot of residents around. Now, on to tonight's presentation. Are we all good with the AV and everything? Thumbs up? Perfect. Most everyone in St. Genevieve is aware of the Weingarten POW camp, and as I mentioned earlier, many of us know people who have known people who worked there at the time. I think it's always a matter of interest. And a lot of people, young people, they have no idea that it even existed because there's really no representation of it left hardly at all. So again, our presentation is sponsored by Southbound Fuel, Bob and Denise Grieshaber. We thank them so much for doing so. This is wonderful. David Fiedler has been a writer for more than 20 years. His material has appeared in the Wall Street Journal and has been carried by the Associated Press and the New York Times syndicate. Writing The Enemy Among Us allowed Dave, a lifelong Missourian, to combine his knowledge of the state with degrees in German and political science and experience as an officer in the U.S. Army. For it, he received the Governor's Award for the Humanities, and Dave also wrote an accompanying novel and screenplay to go with the original history. So, you waited long enough, you made the journey across the street, and we certainly thank you for your patience and your time. And let's bring on up Dave Fiedler.
Thank you. Perfect. Well, hi everybody. Thank you so much. What a thrill to be here. And I'd like to second the thanks for your flexibility. This is a great problem to have. And, you know, a lot of interest reflects the local connection here. And I have to say, this may be the first presentation I've ever given with bar service available. So if things get slow, feel free to help yourself. Just keep the jukebox to a minimum if you don't mind, all right? I'm going to move around a little bit. I'm going to try to be where I can see you but not block things. So I'll walk around and hopefully it'll all work out. But Steph had a great introduction, and I just really appreciate that because as I give presentations, you know, usually it's about 90% of the people who say, prisoners of war, here in Missouri, I had no idea. You know, I say 15,000 German and Italians in Missouri, and they just are astonished by that. And there'll maybe be a small percentage who will say, sure, you know, I remember that there was a camp in St. Genevieve County, or I grew up near Fort Leonard Wood, and my dad worked at the camp. You know, that 90% knowing nothing and 10% having some connection, I think has been turned on its head here with the amount of interest and awareness in our crowd tonight. And so it's going to be a delight to speak with you about that. And I really like to thank the people at the Learning Center for their promotion and the great job they do in so many areas and in putting on our talk tonight. So what is this about? I talked twice today at St. Genevieve High School. And as I told the kids there, you know, to them, World War II seems like ancient history. It may as well be the Civil War, right? Yeah. And all of a sudden, though, I started doing the math, and it has been 80 years since the end of World War II. And we all either know or have known people who had direct connections to World War II, but it is a smaller and smaller number. Despite that, this is World War II history that took place right here at home. And it's close geographically, and it's still close chronologically as far as history goes. So we'll talk about what the prisoners were, what brought them here, what they did while they were here, the kind of relations they had with people, and a lot of stories that not only I've heard, in the course of working on this, but that you'll have the chance to share as well with your own connections to the prisoner of war camps, and particularly here in Weingarten. So I live in St. Louis. I got folks in between Perryville and Cape, so very local. I don't live in St. Genevieve County, but have had the great pleasure of spending a lot of time here and just in this part of Missouri. So it's great to be here, and I'd like to say thanks again. Why did these prisoners of war come to Missouri in the first place? There was World War II, as you remember. Next slide, please. I got my AV assistant in the back. He's the one that's closest to the bar. If the slides get a little sloppy later on, we'll know why that is. World War II started in September 1931 when Germany invaded Poland. And it was a full 2 years until the United States got in, right? What happened in December 1941? Pearl Harbor. And all of a sudden, the United States is hip deep in a war that our allies had already been involved with for 2 years. And so Germany and France and the other allied countries had already captured a lot of prisoners of war. And those countries, being smaller and much closer to the European theater, were in danger of being overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of prisoners. These are Italian prisoners of war that were being captured in North Africa. Next slide, please. Germans that were being captured in the fighting in Europe, and they really had no place to put them. And so very quickly our allies said, hey, United States, can you help us please by assuming as many of these prisoners as possible? And I trust you all can hear me okay. It sounds good, and as I move around, the microphone's not gotten funny. And the United States said, yes, absolutely, we're in this with you, but we got to figure out where to put them ourselves. And so as the United States began to receive great numbers of prisoners of war, 50,000 a month in early months of 1942, 75,000 a month. I mean, they were really coming fast and furious. Our government was trying to figure out where to put them. And the criteria was, we're going to locate them on prisoner of war camps that are not too close to the coasts, not too close to the borders of Canada and Mexico, not too close to large cities where it would be easier for prisoners to slip away and blend in, or else would be attractive targets of sabotage or other misbehavior. And when you start to add all those factors together, next slide please. Missouri looks like a pretty attractive place, right? Still very rural in great parts of our state. It was that much more so back then. The first 4 places that were used to house the prisoners of war were really, in 3 out of the 4 cases, existing military bases, right? You're familiar with Fort Leonard Wood in the middle of the state. That held 5,000 German prisoners of war. Down in southwest Missouri by Joplin and Springfield, you had Camp Crowder, which was in Neosho, Missouri, held 3,000 Germans, and Camp Clark in Nevada, Missouri, held 4,000 Germans. And so you had those 3 on existing military bases. And then the 4th, of course, was Camp Weingarten, right here in St. Genevieve County. And it was different for a number of reasons. It was built specifically to be an internment camp, and originally intended as a possible destination for Japanese Americans who were interned, but became a prisoner of war camp. But specifically a prisoner of war camp with no other military purpose, and designed and built specifically for Italian prisoners of war with a capacity of 5,600 prisoners, which, if you think about it, that is a massive operation. Now, I asked some of the high school kids today, I said, what's the population of St. Genevieve, the city proper? As you can imagine, the guesses were all over the place, but they were actually, within the realm of possibility. Who knows what it is within, 1,000 or so? 4,000, right? It's kind of in there. If we've got 5,000 or more Italians alone, and in Weingarten of all places, right? I mean, just kind of to have that boom set in, a very rural area with another 1,000 Americans needing to run the place. It not only was it a huge operation, but it greatly affected the larger area. All of a sudden, there's a great housing shortage in St. Genevieve, Farmington too. All the little towns, any place that could be used to house soldiers and American civilian workers was occupied. Restaurants, taverns, everything was just slammed. There was people everywhere, construction everywhere, cars everywhere. It was really an incredible time in terms of great changes to the landscape. Now, early on, our government was really concerned about these prisoners of war and where they would be housed. Saw them as dangerous, dangerous men who were a threat to escape. They were a threat to cause problems, and they really needed to be guarded closely. And so, again, they were placed in these facilities that were really, really securely built. Next slide, please. They were large compounds that had like tall barbed wire fences around the outside, 8 foot or more, with the wire on the top to keep people from climbing out. Guard towers, military policemen on horseback, searchlights, guard dogs, all the things that indicated these are dangerous men that need to be closely guarded. The typical setup, and this is sort of representative of camps generally, would be something like this, where each of those black rectangles would represent a barracks that would hold about 50 soldiers. And along that were mess halls and other facilities. So each of those compounds, for instance, in this one, the one left, center, and right, would hold 1,000 people each. So that would be a 3,000 person camp, typical layout. Administrative area up front, you know, if you think again of these being comparable to a small town, would have things like hospitals and theaters and water treatment plants and a fire department, all that kind of infrastructure. Recreation area at the top was really just a big open field. It could be used for sports. It was used in the morning, for instance, as a parade grounds or assembly area.
Talking about a crowd, the bar is open. Would you make that announcement?
Yeah, absolutely.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. And I tell you now, that will greatly help this talk. for you and me both. But yeah, seriously, feel free if you'd enjoy a beer or soda or whatever you like, make yourself at home. The recreation area had a parade ground where the prisoners could be assembled at the start of the day for head count and work assignments and things like that. But again, it was designed to hold people in place. Next slide, please. I mentioned the guard towers. You see maybe in the middle, if you squint, there's a soldier holding a rifle with his foot on the rail. Everybody see that? And there's windows inside. There was a 50 caliber machine gun inside that would swivel. Searchlights on the top. You can see the barbed wire down below. Next slide, please. Barracks that looked like this, and this was actually taken, this photograph was taken at Weingarten, and single-story barracks that were open bay, had bunks, and looked a lot like barracks that soldiers have lived in for the last century. Next slide, please. Two-story barracks like this would be at Fort Leonard Wood. The key was they weren't just stuck in any old building early on. The rule about prisoners of war was that they needed to be treated the same as you treated your own soldiers, right? If American soldiers were sleeping in barracks, the prisoners of war at that same place would as well. Eat the same types of food, the same quantities of food, and so their existence was very much the same as our soldiers in those days. Also, something to note, this doesn't look like some luxury accommodations, but they were there for 2 or 3 or 4 years, depending on, and so they had the chance to really beautify their living spaces. There's benches there. They would build flower gardens. There'd be competitions between different prisoner of war companies to who could make the most beautiful areas inside and out. The Germans built bandstands and beer gardens, and Italians would make rock gardens and all sorts of things with the amount of time that they were there to really decorate it and make it home. Next slide, please. That same sort of comfort extended to the inside of the barracks. This doesn't look like any sort of fancy hotel, but when you're a prisoner of war who's coming from the battlefield and you've been shot at and you've been sleeping in a barn if you were lucky and not eating hot meals regularly and no such thing as hot showers, this was not only a surprise, but it was really seen as an incredible luxury and much better treatment than they expected. Some things to point out there. Anybody see what's in the middle there, right by the door? Hey, they got a dog, right? Gosh, prisoner of war life is rough. We got pets running around. Somebody taught it a kind of sit up and beg trick there. Carpets on the floor, curtains in the windows, light fixtures, quilts on the beds, a little sort of nightstand table with a cover there. And again, the prisoners were really surprised by this sort of good treatment and ample amounts of decent food, and the fact that the abuse. If you're a prisoner of war, you're not sure what your fate is going to be, right? You don't know if malnourishment or mistreatment is your future. So to come here and find these kind of conditions was a great shock and eventual reflection of gratitude for this treatment that they experienced. Next slide, please. So, when we talked about the Geneva Convention, and again, that's rules of war, and it applied specifically to the prisoners, it did say that you could require enlisted prisoners to work under certain conditions. One, it couldn't be anything that was dangerous to them personally or harmful. Two, it couldn't be too directly related to the war effort. You couldn't have them making munitions, for instance. And three, you had to pay them for their labor. How about that? Not only do you get to have a dog in camp that you can teach tricks to, but when you go to work every day, you're drawing same wages for it, equivalent as what our GIs were. So that was another surprise. This money could be used in the camp stores, and we'll talk about that in a second, or it could be socked away in savings accounts to be taken home to Europe and used to help get started in life again after the war. A great amount of prisoner labor was engaged in upkeep of the camp themselves, right? If you had 5,000 prisoners of war, you had a great need for simple things like barbers and bakers and people in the laundry. This is a trash crew. This is at Camp Crowder. And you see the POW uniform. Their kind of everyday work uniform was like a denim set of coveralls with PW on the back, like you see that guy there, and on their shins. And these guys got a truck and they're running around emptying trash cans out at, again, Camp Crowder. Next slide. They also worked in road construction and repair. This is a retention wall at Camp Crowder. Next, please. They worked in the mess halls, not only feeding themselves, but in the case of Fort Leonard Wood and those other camps, they were large training bases, and so they provided sort of the food service to American servicemen. The government was actually pretty nimble in this program and adjusting it when necessary to make it work. Again, that rule about treat the prisoners the way you do your own soldiers. If our GIs are eating hot dogs and Jell-O and corn, early on they said, well, okay, Italians, here you get hot dogs and Jell-O and corn. And that may not necessarily have been what they were accustomed to, of course. And so somebody saw that a great amount of food was being wasted, and they said, let's see if we can adjust this. And so instead of hot dogs, Jell-O and corn, it's pasta, it's tomato paste, it's garlic, olive oil, things like that the kid not only used to make stuff that was sort of more in line with their palate from back home, but the Americans figured out that, hey, we can have Italian fine dining instead of hot dogs, Jell-O, and corn. So, they would ditch their own mess hall and run through to where the Italians were working. Next slide, please. This was taken at Weingarten. Prisoners who had medical training would be, of course, put to work in those fields because those areas were in short supply. You'd have doctors or dentists or x-ray technicians or lab people. You'd put them to work. This is at the hospital at Weingarten, because not only were those medical professions in short supply, but what a great help it was just to be able to talk to somebody in their own language, and they could explain, oh, it's my appendix, or my head hurts, or whatever it is. So that employed a lot of prisoners of war, and again, the Italians right here in St. Genevieve County. Next slide. These were productive work programs, right? It wasn't just make busy, kind of find stuff to fill people's time. These were jobs that needed to be done that if they didn't have prisoner labor for, would have either required Americans to do or gone undone, but it wasn't just something to fill up idle hours. It was productive work, and it was a great thing because it did keep the prisoners busy. And if you've ever had a situation where you or kids have sat idle for hours on end, holy cow, that's where a recipe for trouble, right? That's when you have people fight or plot escapes or other mischief. So to have productive ways to spend time and earn money in the process was a great thing. And the United States benefited from this, and the prisoners did too. Next slide. So, we didn't pay them in cash, right? Because cash can be used to buy a train ticket or bribe somebody for a ride or whatever. Instead, it was either, again, saved in those accounts I mentioned, or provided in coupons that could be used in the camp store. Now, this is where the prisoner of war program ran into a little bit of a bump. again, the rule of you make available to the prisoners what you make available for your own soldiers. If our GIs could finish their duty shift and have chocolate or cigarettes, or they could buy cologne or stationery or socks or anything like that in these stores, to all of a sudden have those available to the prisoners too was a fine thing in concept. But if you picture you and me living outside of one of these camps, right? So we're here, we're living here now, and things are rationed. They're in short supply. We don't have tons of meat or butter or eggs or milk. We really are scrimping to get by because of the war effort. Yet we hear on the other side of this wall where these, supposedly evil men are, oh boy, they're living the high life. They've got all this stuff available to them that we don't. Gosh, can you imagine the kind of the way people felt about that? That's absolutely true. And our government was caught up in a pretty big storm of controversy and criticism about how we're pampering these prisoners of war. We're just treating them in such a fine way. We don't want to mistreat anybody, but this is going too far the other direction, putting them up in these country clubs. And that was really criticism that didn't go away until the end of the war. And it was difficult to explain, but the United States did have rationale for the good treatment. One, just on its face, it was the right thing to do, right? That we vowed to uphold the Geneva Convention, and that's what we're going to do. Two, it was a motivation for those people still fighting on behalf of those countries to surrender. Because if they heard that people who were captured were not abused, were not suffering, and in fact were living an existence that was 10 times or more better than life on the battlefield, you don't think that crossed people's mind? Absolutely it did. Three, we needed the work, and that was an incentive for the work program to go so well. And then number four, kind of on a real high philosophical level, we realized that the prisoners of war that were held here were going to go back to Europe after the war and be involved in recreating society in Europe after World War II. So to expose them to the ideas of democracy and fair treatment and a very positive image of the United States was seen as a good thing. Now, is there scientific studies that say, prisoner attitude went from here to here because of this? I don't know, I've never seen them. But what I can tell you, and you've probably heard the same stories, is that for years, decades after the war, people would encounter foreign prisoners of war, either here in the United States or over in Europe. And as an example of that, somebody talked about being on a bus tour in Europe in the 1980s, and the bus driver spoke perfect English. And they asked him how this was. He said, I was a prisoner of war in the United States. And he said, I love America, you guys were great. We can't believe, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but we can't believe how well we were treated, and for that we have always been grateful to the United States. So that was a big wave of gratitude and affection for our country and sort of the democratic way of life that paid off in big ways over the years. So that's sort of how things played out, even beyond the, gosh, look at them living it up in there and we don't have it. Next slide. So when we talk about the camps, and you'll hear some of this tonight later on about the camp at Weingarten in particular and what physical traces remain there, the kinds of things that are left are the very permanent things that they built. Stonework primarily among them. This is at Fort Leonard Wood. German masons built a lot of stuff there that you can still see today. Rock walls like that. Next, please. Steps. This kind of stuff's all over the place. A big culvert, next please, under the main road through town. And not only would they, build that with some pretty excellent craftsmanship, but they would leave trace of, kind of a signature like an artist. You see there in the center, next slide please, up close, PW, prisoners of war, August of 1943. So that was 81 years ago, and that's still there. Next, please. On the outside of the chimney at Fort Leonard Wood, German POW, 1945. And then I think a lot of you are probably familiar with this, have seen this before. Next slide shows the fireplace that still stands at Weingarten. Next, please. As the most visible sort of trace of the camp in terms of proximity to the road and a pretty dramatic structure. Now, if you remember those one-story barracks that were up on the stilts or on the concrete posts, that's what this was. And so the chimney looks, the fireplace looks like it's pretty high in the air, but that had been floor level inside the building, raised up on those stilts, and would have heated the inside of the room. I believe that was an officers club at Camp Weingarten. So that's the kinds of things that you still can see today. There's not a lot left at Weingarten in particular. The camp itself we didn't talk about, but all of a sudden in 1941, the summer of 1941, in 42, there's government people that are kind of sniffing around at the county courthouse, looking at land records. All of a sudden, there's murmuring of something going on, and it was basically the government says, we are seizing this property, and there were people who had been on farms for generations that didn't have a choice but to move, and so the government acquired almost 1,000 acres there, and after the war, it was made available again to those families. But can you imagine trying to get restarted in that? Are they even still here? Are they in a position to take the land back? So it was a disruptive thing. The land is now basically back in farm or pasture, and the government completely cleared away most of the buildings and infrastructure as the camp was closing, and so there's very, very few small physical traces left. And I know we've got people here who can talk about maybe things that they've seen at the right time, but my point is that the physical things, there's not lots left. Next slide, please. So even though there's like relatively few physical traces, a great dramatic shift occurred that really sort of, in terms of memory and personal interaction and the things that have remained from that, changed it pretty significantly. And that was a shift from having the prisoners of war in 4 huge camps with, again, 4,000 or 5,000 people, a shift to a series of branch camps, largely tied to agriculture, all across the state, like 24 little camps that dotted all across Missouri and elsewhere. And as you've surmised, the prisoners of war were all across the country as the program expanded. And so this thing I'm describing, the work in agriculture and timber and mining and everything else, played out over the country. But what happened is the government figured out that the prisoners of war could work outside of the camps without everyone running away or causing a bunch of havoc in the countryside, and that dramatically shifted it. What sparked it, anyone know who this is? Rosie the Riveter, right. And Rosie the Riveter represents all the American women who went to the work in the defense industries and factories to fill in for men who had gone directly to the battlefield. There was a huge shortage in labor, a huge labor shortage in industry. Where Rosie stepped in, there was a huge shortage in agriculture, but not an easy similar answer. In 1943, it was severe enough that crops planted in the spring were going to rot in the fields in the fall because there was no one there to bring them in. And the government said, what are we going to do here? How do we solve this dilemma? And somebody suggested, maybe we can use these prisoners of war. Oh no, it's too dangerous. It seemed to be a very risky thing. And so they hemmed and hawed and back and forth on it. And finally, in May of 1943, an event happened, had a national impact, and actually was covered nationally in the news. An event happened that played out right here in St. Genevieve that caused that dramatic shift. And that was, next slide please, heavy rains that took place into the spring and summer, and the rivers were up, right? The Missouri River right here, the Mississippi in particular in St. Genevieve was up. Farmland was underwater, buildings were going under, and the river kept rising, and there was no one to fight the floods as they would have been in a kind of a normal scenario. And so somebody finally said, this is a perilous enough situation. What about those Italian prisoners of war that had been dropped off at the camp of Weingarten literally 2 weeks before, in May of 1943? We should try it. Let's put them to work doing fighting the floods. If they all run off, if they don't do what they're supposed to, we're not going to be in any worse situation than we've been before. We must do it. So they organized trucks. They brought the prisoners to St. Genevieve. That's them lined up across the middle in the dark uniforms. Organized sandbag brigades and started filling sandbags and slinging them for about 36 hours straight. Reinforced the levees, raised raised these sandbag walls to hold the water back so that no more damage was done. Hooray for St. Genevieve. What a relief it was here. And hooray for this whole idea, said the Army and farmers and everybody else who said, maybe we can use these prisoners of war outside the camp without them all just going crazy. And this, I mentioned, it seriously was a national sensation. It was sort of the first acknowledgement not only that there were prisoners of war here, because it was a pretty low, they tried to keep it as a low profile program, but that they were working outside of these tightly guarded camps. And that created this significant change, next slide please, to create the branch camp program, which instead of those 4 big camps, suddenly put prisoners of war all across the state, again working largely in agriculture. You see down in the boot heel with soybeans and cotton, St. Louis on military facilities there, Jefferson Barracks and an ordnance depot that was sort of in North City, in farms in the Chesterfield Valley. Central Missouri was corn around Columbia, Boone County, Columbia and Fulton. Kansas City was potatoes. And the big shift, of course, was instead of this, what people perceived to be this really ferocious mob of the dangerous enemy men behind the fence, all of a sudden it's like 18 and 19-year-old young men, next slide please, riding through town in the back of a truck in the morning. These are Italians who had been at Weingarten, who went to work over closer to Kansas City picking potatoes. And they're singing and they're waving. Next slide, please. They're smiling. They posed for pictures with these young ladies. I mean, to meet somebody from Italy, holy cow. I mean, that didn't just happen every day. I mean, it was really an astonishing shift sort of in the interaction of the prisoners with ordinary people and the way they were perceived. All of a sudden, it put a very human face, as you might imagine, on something that had just existed previously behind barbed wire and searchlights and guard dogs and all that. Next slide, please. So, the interesting part of this story to me, uninteresting part, is that in the challenge in the horrible aspects of World War II that came out, a very positive human aspect was a flip side result that played out in the prisoner of war story here in Missouri. And elsewhere, but we'll talk specifically about Missouri. These were Italians who had been at Weingarten. This was one of the first work details that went out. The corn growers in central Missouri needed people to detassel corn. So they contracted with the Italians, with the government to bring the Italians at Weingarten to come work in the cornfields. Now they needed some place to put them, where the military bases were pretty organized and orderly. You saw the barracks, you saw the rows of buildings, and it was a little more free-for-all out in these little branch camps. So they would put the prisoners basically anywhere suitable they could find them. So Boone County, Columbia, Missouri, summertime, gosh, I wonder what's available to house these prisoners of war. Next slide, please. There you have the Sigma Phi Epsilon prisoner of war camp, right? University of Missouri campus. It's going to be quiet during the summer normally, but especially during wartime, the fraternity house is completely empty. And actually, the fraternity itself has got a mortgage on their house just like everybody else. And if they don't have people in the house paying fraternity dues, they got to figure out a way to do it. So the fraternity leased this house to the Italians, to the corn growers, to house the Italians for 6 weeks in the summer of 1943. And can you imagine? I mean, right in the middle of Columbia. And if there was a fence around it, it was largely symbolic. One of the things that the prisoners of war experienced, and something that came out of this, and this is a direct quote. When I was researching the book, I had the chance to speak with a man, an Italian man who was housed in this place. And he talked about getting to go to movies in downtown Columbia in their off hours. One of the early Disney films, and hearing the laughter of the children in the darkness, things like that, that reminded him of home and his families. To be able to attend Mass at the Catholic Church in Columbia. He said, the people in Missouri, the people in Columbia treated us like human beings. And that's what they took from it. Next slide, please. Here's another example of that. The sort of friendships that grew out of it. This takes place in South St. Louis County, not too far from where I live, actually. Sappington Road, at that time, of course, had farmland. And a man named Mr. Wagner, Charles Wagner, had a farm that he bought, had an apple orchard that was overgrown, and a barn that was about to fall down. And so he contracted with these 4 Germans to come work at his place. And he wasn't going into this because he was looking for friends. He had work that he needed to do, and they were going to do it for him. And so every morning he would drive out to the camp in Chesterfield and pick them up from where the German prisoners of war were staying, and they'd come and work at his place, and he'd take them back at night. But over the course of that summer, you know, working side by side, sort of mutual respect and affection grew up to the point where when it was time for them to leave, he traded addresses, in particular with the man in the white, whose name was Nicholas Pauscher. And when I was researching this book, I sat in the living room of that house that still stands. And Mr. Wagner's son brought out a shoebox full of letters. It was just packed full of letters that Mr. Wagner, his dad, and Mr. Pauscher had written each other over the years. And it was that crinkly paper that's so thin you can almost see through, the airmail stuff that you save on postage, and bound with a red ribbon. And it was things like, "Dear Mr. Wagner," this was immediately after the Germans went back when things were terrible in Europe. "Dear Mr. Wagner, thank you for the package of food that you sent us. It's been bitterly cold here this winter, and we've have nothing to eat, and what you sent is literally helping us make it through." Another one said, "Thank you for the winter coat that you sent. It fits my wife perfectly, and it's like a gift from heaven." So, I mean, think about that, right? The situation that brought them together, initially as prisoner of war in a country that was holding these men, and to have that come out on the other side is pretty special. One more to talk about. Next slide, please. This may not look like a card you'd get from Hallmark or, you know, pick up that you'd actually send anybody, but it is a birthday card. And the 4 men you see at the bottom, Karl, Fritz, Wolfgang, and Kurt, I picture these 4 prisoners of war sitting, like, you maybe can't see the steps down there, but concrete steps at the front of the barracks. And English is not their native language, right? But they're trying to figure out how to say, "Happy birthday, Mr. McDonald," just because of the sort of respect that they have for him, and, you know, the way that they've come to interact with him over their time at Camp Clark. So May of 1945, this will be 80 years from now, next May. The POW employees of the Sewage Disposal Plant at Camp Clark congratulate Mr. McDonald on your birthday. We wish you good luck for the future. And they, you know, signed it. A very simple expression, but, you know, pretty meaningful. Not only do I see those 4 Germans sitting on the steps trying to figure out how to say that, and, you know, what penmanship, right? It's not fancy cursive, but it's just really neat printing. Mr. McDonald's widow, a woman named Nora McDonald, is the one who shared this letter with me. And you can see it there, the crinkles on it, the way she's folded it and unfolded it over the years, countless times, you know, remembering her husband and the man he was to her and to these Germans evidently as well. Next slide, please. We'll talk just for a second about camp recreation. You know, I don't want to make it sound all sunshine. I mentioned Disney films, like a Hallmark movie, right? Sunday night, sunshine and daisies and everything. The United States missed the boat early on when they didn't identify like the true hardcore Nazis among the Germans, estimated to be 15 to 20% true sort of loyalist members of the National Socialist Party. Those were people who were intent on causing trouble for the United States and for their fellow soldiers whom they considered to be too complicit. You know, if you've got 15 to 20% Nazis and the others, you know, 75, 80%, you know, patriotic people who love Germany and want to serve their country but aren't necessarily, you know, all in like the other guys, you know, to participate in the work program and sort of cooperate could have been a dangerous thing. And so there were problems there that our government allowed to have happen when they initially failed to sort out the Germans. And, you know, there were people here, Americans, who were never happy about having the prisoners of war around, right? If my husband or father or son or brother is over there and he's still getting shot out by these same, you know, counterparts of these guys, I still don't think I'm going to, you know, want to go around giving people hugs all the time. So I don't want to carry it away too far in either direction. My point is that it was, you know, a surprisingly good time for people involved in ways that they never expected. We talked about prisoners' work. They had a chance for recreation too. There was an opportunity for sports. You see the prisoners, these are Germans at Fort Leonard Wood. They're wearing uniforms, right? They participated in a trophy in a tournament, soccer tournament at the camp, posing with the trophy. Next slide. There's opportunities for sort of self-study and education, or just reading for recreation in camp libraries. There's newspapers and magazines, not only in their own language, but in English as well. Music was popular. Next slide. You would have opportunities for music. These are Italians who were at Weingarten. They'd have instruments that they would either buy or that would be donated by the Red Cross or the Catholic Church or another religious organization. And so they would play for their own enjoyment, or in the case of like Camp Weingarten, open up mixers or socials, whatever you want to call it, dances where people from the communities could come and dance with the servicemen, and this was the entertainment. Next slide, please. This is in the days before television, right? At least commonly in everybody's house. Maybe there was radio, certainly wasn't internet and the whole range of entertainment opportunities to people today. So to have live entertainment in a small town, holy cow. These are Germans, they put down a vaudeville show. You'd have musicians and magicians and jugglers and ventriloquists and all kinds of funny little skits, people putting on comedy acts. I got to get a lot of credit, right, to be able to put on theater in that setting. Sometimes you had to improvise a little bit or maybe squint your eyes. Next slide, please. To tell even that good-looking gal on the left. That's Mrs. Fritz, somebody said. So, but again, wholesome way to spend time that wasn't working, just to provide some enjoyment in everybody's day-to-day life. Next, please. There were like hobby shops, little arts and crafts opportunities. This was given to the supervisor, the American supervisor at the carpentry shop at Weingarten, painted by one of the Italian soldiers that worked there for him. Still hangs in a living room today. The prisoners were entrepreneurial at times as well. They found ways to make money. Next slide. They would take a picture of somebody's, like a wallet-sized picture of somebody's wife or girlfriend, and with oil painting, make a full-size, full-color portrait like you see on the right. And you maybe trade it for cigarettes or chocolate or something else. Next, please. Little bits of metal and wood could be used to create something like this. This is an Italian Navy destroyer that somebody built. There's all sorts of items like that they made and gave away or traded that people still have. On a larger scale would be something like this. Next, please. Which is a model village in the space between the barracks at Camp Crowder. Now, I know it's probably a little hard to tell, but it's like a Bavarian village. There was little electric lights that went on and off, a train that went round and round. You see the church at the right center with the steeple. Bottom right, that dark shape in the corner is a little mill pond, and there's a sawmill, water-driven wheel that operated a sawmill. And it just, again, shows what they could come up with, given some free time and creativity and access to just kind of scrap material around the camp. All right, so how does the story end? Are there still Italians living at Weingarten, Missouri? Anybody ever met any? Okay. They've all gone home. They all went home. The government was very clear early on. Everybody's going home after the war. There's no opportunity to stay here. And that was for a couple of reasons. One is that, again, the whole notion of rebuilding Europe and society there, these were people that there was work to be done over there and families that needed care and everything else. They needed to go home. And we were also bringing home hundreds of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of our own servicemen and women too, who needed jobs and housing and education and everything else. So there was no chance of staying here. How they went home, next slide please, varied depending on nationality and sort of where they were located and what they were doing. These are Italians wearing new uniforms, marching out behind the Italian flag. There's a band there in the background. This is 1944. Well, think about that a little bit. They are leaving the camp. They're marching down to the train tracks there, getting ready to get on a train. As you may recall, Italy, which started out as one of our enemies, right, lined up with Germany and Japan, folded up about halfway through and became an allied country with the United States, France, England, and so on. And so that led to an interesting question. These Italian prisoners that we have as prisoners, what's their status? And the answer was, next please, to make special Italian military units like the ones that we just saw, leaving Camp Weingarten, going out and being organized to work much more directly with the United States and for the United States in the war efforts. They wore the same uniforms as our American servicemen, with the exception of that green Italy patch on the sleeve, and they worked in that capacity to the end of the war. Once the war was done, the Italians began going home relatively quickly, like September of 1945, and by January 1946, all the Italians were back in Italy. Next, please. For the Germans, it was a different deal. There was never any question of them leaving the camp in some sort of different status. They remained as prisoners of war not only through the summer and fall of 1945, but well into 1946. We still needed their labor. The situation in Europe was still very much in flux. And if there were 450,000 prisoners of war in the United States, about 300,000 of them were Germans, and we didn't want to just dump 300,000 Germans in Germany without kind of an organized plan. So they stayed and worked through the summer of 1946 and eventually returned to Europe. Now, I mentioned none of the prisoners were allowed to stay, although a number of them would have had they been given that option. They got to know people here. They knew the opportunities that were here. For various reasons, they didn't want to go back to Germany. One of them was a man named Hans Fischer, who was held here. His family had already suffered back in Germany at the hands of the Nazis. So there was no love lost there. Even in the United States, he knew that he wanted to be here, and so sent back home, but was paying attention and sort of watching and waiting. There was word that eventually immigration to the United States was going to reopen. And so 5 full years after the war, in 1950, Harry Truman announced that the immigration to the United States was being reopened to a limited number of people. And it talks about a mad rush through the streets of Berlin to get to the U.S. consulate in time to get one of those precious visas that would allow him to come. And he must have been fast, because he got there in time to get that permission to allow him and his wife to come. Arrived here in 1951, settled in St. Louis, worked his whole career as an engineer, and had lived in St. Louis up until a couple of years ago. Another one is, next slide please, Giuseppe Zanti. And Mr. Zanti, as you might guess, is Italian. He was held at Jefferson Barracks. Remember how I talked about those Italian service units and permissions changed where they were able to kind of operate much more like American GIs? He had all kinds of family already living on the hill in St. Louis. So he would get out on weekends, he'd see his cousins, he would talk to Italian girls in the neighborhood. Again, how's that for life as a prisoner of war, right? He moved back to the United States. He was sent back to Italy and returned to the Hill in 1954 and lived there through the rest of his life as well. And I had the opportunity to meet him researching this book. The number of people who came back as immigrants was relatively small, right? If we're talking about 400-some thousand prisoners of war total, it may have been 5,000 or 10,000 that came back as immigrants. When I was working on this book in the early 2000s in St. Louis, I was aware of maybe 8 to 10 people that I talked with who had returned as prisoners of war. Not an infinitesimal number, but it wasn't hundreds either. A good many more started to come back, though, as visitors. In the early 90s, all of a sudden these gentlemen are retirement age, and they had time and money to travel and a desire to see the places where they had been held. And so, next slide, please. You would have an opportunity where in one of these towns, like in Neosho, where a car would pull up one day and a guy would get out and, I can't believe it, I haven't been here in 40 years. Karl-Heinz Richter was one of those. Now, we don't know him from the name, but he's the guy that took a lot of pictures as a prisoner of war. He took that picture of the barracks interior with the dog, saw early on. He took a picture of that model village that we saw just a couple of minutes ago. He kept a journal that was enormously fascinating. you know, we talk about these prisoners of war not knowing what they're going to experience. I mean, it's fear, it's anxiety. Am I going to ever go back home again? Am I going to be mistreated? Am I going to have enough to eat? And he had those same worries. He described it. You know, getting on a train when he entered the United States and went like, you know, 3 days and nights across the country. And where am I going? Where am I going to end up? And finally, you know, he felt the train shift off the main rail line and onto a siding that took him into the camp. And he's exhausted from the journey and he's filled with fear. You know, this may be the last place he ever lives. So he talks about rubbing the dust off the window of the train car. And he's trying to look out at the camp and see the prisoners that were already there and how much these poor men must have already suffered. And here comes 2 of his fellow Germans walking by. And they're carrying tennis rackets. So, you know, he's one that enjoyed his time. Again, he was a prisoner of war here and he missed his family, wanted to be back home, but he did make the most of it. And I was really looking forward to having the opportunity to visit with him in person, ideally. He went back to Neosho, Missouri, where Camp Crowder was. He wrote the mayor and said, "I'd like to return, can you help me?" And she said, "We would welcome you back." And when he arrived, she was there to meet him with the high school marching band and the local TV news crew and, you know, a couple hundred people from the town. He thought, this is great. You know, I love Neosho. So, number of visits. He met George Kelly, the chief of police. And it was during the course of my research that I was introduced to George Kelly and then the connection with him. And he and George Kelly were friends enough that they visited each other again and again. When I was working on this book, Karl-Heinz Richter was going to Florida and George Kelly was going to meet him, a place that they both traveled. And Karl-Heinz Richter got there, he called George Kelly, his friend who was still in Missouri, said, "I'm here, can't wait to see you, George. You know, you'll be down in a couple of days and can't wait." Well, the phone rang a second time at George Kelly's house that day. It wasn't his friend, it was the people at the hotel. And they were calling to say that Karl-Heinz Richter had had a heart attack and passed away there on the beach in Florida. And George Kelly, you know, sat down and relayed that message to me with the words, "He was a fine friend and I'm going to miss him very much." So, you know, in the whole context of World War II and all the terrible things that took place and all the atrocities, you know, I see this as a positive that came out of it. And you all have heard the quote from General Douglas MacArthur, who said, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." And, you know, it's been 80 years. Memories are growing more faint. The old soldiers are fading away. But I think when it comes down to it, it can never diminish the significance of the time that they were here and what they experienced as prisoners of war in Missouri in St. Genevieve County. Thank you very much. So I really appreciate your attention. I know we've got lots of questions and times for comment. We've also been talking for a while. If you need to stand up and stretch or use the restroom, that's totally fine. I don't know what the best way to do this is. If there's questions or things that people want to relate, I see a lady with her hand up. If this works, I'll just rove around with the microphone. As long as we're done, I think they said we've got this place until 11 o'clock. Microphone, please.
The picture of Fort Leonard Wood, my father was a career Army officer. In 1959, we were stationed there. Those buildings still existed, and they converted them to military housing. We used to live on the top floor, walk up the steps, a huge open space, big beams in the middle. They added bedrooms, and in the back there was like a no man's land, and there was a big door, and it was sealed off because that was where there were other steps to go down at that particular time. But in 1959, those buildings, or some of them, still existed. And as a military dependent, we lived in one.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, those barracks, I was there in the 90s and stayed in those. If you have the chance to visit Fort Leonard Wood, they do have a nice prisoner of war camp display, sort of a recreation, including the barracks in the center part of the post. I see, I'll talk with you, sir, and then you next. Yes, sir.
What made the government decide to choose Weingarten?
What made the government decide to choose Weingarten? I don't know, other than the availability of land and those criteria that I talked about before. You know, the fact that it was on a rail line was important, relatively close to the river was important. I don't know beyond that. It was close to St. Louis without being too close, is another speculation. And you know, in the whole realm of government wisdom, who knows? But those are a couple of factors that I right offhand.
There's a lot of German-speaking people in this area that can communicate with the German Christians.
Yes, absolutely.
What's your other book about?
Okay, so the question was, what's the other book about? My Enemy, My Love is a novel. It's a fiction, but it's you know, in researching this, a lot of people would tell stories that I couldn't verify. You know, you have to put factual things in history books, and you know, there was some kind of gossipy stuff about, oh, you know, the romance between the prisoners and, you know, people in town, things like that. So the premise is, in Louisiana, Missouri, the governor of Missouri at that time was a guy named Lloyd Stark. And if you've ever heard of Stark Brothers Nurseries, it's still a huge nursery. They are the people that originated the Golden Delicious apple. So Governor Stark, whether it was due to his political influence or not, had prisoner of war labor working in his orchards. And he also had daughters at home at that time. And I'm not going to imply anything because there's nothing factual about that, but in my mind it talked about you know, what might have played out. In this book in particular I talk about, it sort of goes to a Herman, Missouri kind of place. It could be St. Genevieve County. There's a German who is opposed to the Nazis, but he's drafted against his will. He's a professor. He's got expertise in wine growing, grape growing. And in this book, the camp that he's held is owned by a senator, and the daughter's at home, and she's trying to make a go of the farm while dad and her brother, who's in the army, are gone. And so the two of them pair to create a vineyard. And it's just the best thing I mean, it's a romance maybe. There's also gunfights and car chases and stuff blowing up. So it's a little something for everybody. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what time we know what happened to the buildings, but did you explain what happened to them and where they went?
So the question was, we know what happened to the buildings, that they're gone, but what exactly happened to them and where they went. When these camps would close, the government generally made stuff available on the campgrounds to people. You know, you could take the barracks down and haul the wood off elsewhere, and you know, build new stuff in new places. You know, I'm sure people in the room tonight that remember, you know, family members who were involved in, you know, peeling boards off the side of buildings, taking nails out of those boards and building something new. A number of the buildings were relocated to St. Louis for GI housing. There's all sorts of, I mean, it was a huge place with, you know, I think 1,000 some buildings. And so they cleaned it up quick. Some of the stuff was just sort of knocked down in place. But as much as possible, the material was repurposed either locally or elsewhere. I'm sorry? Was it secretive? No, it was like, I don't know if they did it through a bidding or public process, but I mean, I know people who, I don't know if they bought them from the government. You know, for $10 you can have this old building, and they were responsible for getting it down. I think it was a public process in a time that, you know, communication wasn't very easy. It wasn't like you could post something all that readily. Other questions or stories to tell? Yes, ma'am.
When you were talking about the Germans and how there were still some Germans who were faithful to, you know, being Nazis and stuff, like how did they keep them at bay, so to say?
So the question was, if there were German soldiers who were identified as Nazis and bent on causing trouble, what did the government do with that? They removed them from the camps, the ordinary camps that had, you know, the prisoners out working on farms and engaging with people, and put them in a small number of much more, like the early version of the camps, much more intensely guarded. They weren't out working on people's farms. They were much more held together, and not out among everybody and not out in the public doing stuff. So they separated them as much as possible. Yes, sir.
I could tell you about one of the buildings. It was a motor pool.
Okay. You want to hold the microphone?
It it had, Bauman Brothers started business in 43. It was their phone number, phone 299. And when I was born in 40, and whenever I was a kid, we were closing the doors. They were wood doors, 6-foot motor pool. There were 4 little big doors on the motor pool, and each one had 6-foot doors. They were 12 foot wide, 6 one way, 6 feet the other. And the boards were all at an angle. To brace it better, and that was their shop for overnight. And the one side they had a concrete floor where they worked on trucks and overhauled rims and axles and whatever got tore up. But that was one of the motor pools.
Ah, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Can you see that fireplace from anywhere? Like,
Yeah, the question
the
was,
road,
can you
or-
see the fireplace from the road? And yes, if you're familiar with Weingarten, Missouri, Highway 32 goes by, you turn off onto Weingarten Road, actually across the railroad tracks, and you can see it from the road that goes past the houses there. It's on the left-hand side as you go in, I guess. I don't know if that's...
3 quick questions, if I might. Were any of the camps originated as civilian conservation work?
Okay.
And secondly, did most of the Italian and German prisoners, were they aware that the American POWs were generally not being treated as well as they were? And thirdly, were there any Japanese POWs in the U.S.?
Okay. 3 great questions. The first was, did any of the camps start as civilian conservation corps camps? And the answer is yes. In those branch camp programs, as they looked for places to house the workers, in a number of cases, they located them in former CCC camps. Van Meter State Park, for instance, near Marshall, Missouri, was a CCC camp and housed German soldiers. There was a number of those. The second question was, did the German and Italian soldiers know that Americans being held overseas were not being treated as well? I don't think they were aware of that. And yeah, that disparity in treatment was another thing, in addition to just the general good treatment here on its face. Once it came out that our same servicemen were not experiencing the same kind of treatment, really led to a lot of the anger at the government in being seen as too nice to these prisoners. And then the third question was Japanese prisoners of war. If we talk about 300,000 Germans and 150,000 in Italians, and just even in our talk about Missouri, it's been Germans and Italians, there were a total of 5,000 Japanese in the United States. They were only held in 2 camps. One was Iowa, one was Wisconsin. And the biggest factor with that was sort of the nature of the warfare against the Japanese when they weren't inclined to be taken prisoner. And secondly, if we talk about, as the gentleman here mentioned, how many people in this area, for instance, and across Missouri had German heritage, Italians in St. Louis would come down from the Hill and visit the Italian prisoners of war here, much more common in terms of culture and sort of understanding. The Japanese didn't have the same sort of connection in most cases. They didn't ever work outside the camps. The labor programs didn't work. So they were just housed in those 2 camps, and that was it. One of the questions that I get, or one of the more interesting parts of this, was escapes, and we haven't talked about that yet. Did any of the prisoners ever escape? Is one that comes up a lot, and particularly when they started working out in these fields with a real lack of supervision, there was plenty of opportunity for it, right? There would be, for instance, in the detasseling, there would be 100 prisoners working a cornfield, and the one guy who's supposed to be watching them is asleep under a tree somewhere. So, I mean, that's the level of guarding that they had. I mentioned the people in Sappington, the Nicholas Pauscher. One day, Mr. Wagner wasn't available to drive them back to camp, and they were worried about getting in trouble. So they said, Mr. Wagner said, "Here, just take my car, drive yourselves back." And they did. And they got in trouble when they drove the car in, and he got in trouble for letting them do it. But, it goes to show kind of the level of trust. In Farmington, there was young ladies that related the story of seeing an Army truck pull up, and the guard got down and opened the gate of the truck, and he handed his rifle to one of the prisoners, who held it for him while the prisoners climbed down out of the truck. And then, you know, once he got everything situated, they handed him his rifle back and everything was good. One more example of that, there was a mishap in the guard tower at Weingarten where a private accidentally shot himself in the foot. And after that, the camp commander said, no more live ammunition in these guard towers. So they weren't, you know, obviously didn't tell the prisoners that, but they were standing up there without live ammunition to avoid any other accidents. Escapes happened, but only rarely. It was usually kind of like a high school senior in late April, where I'm just so bored. I got to get out of this. I can't take it anymore. I got to get out and see some things. Some of the Italians were down in the boot heel, like in Kennett, and one of the guys said, hey, I've got relatives in Chicago. We should get out of here. We can get up to Chicago and we'll have a big time. This is going to be great. And so they waited till nightfall and they slipped out of the camp, headed straight south. And they got down, you know, this is before the boot heel had been drained, right? Swamp East, Missouri. And of course there's chiggers and there's snakes and everything else. And it didn't take long before, you know, they found a farmhouse and said, please take us back to that camp. You know, this is terrible. The one example in Weingarten, there were two prisoners that decided they wanted to get out. And I don't know if they thought they were going to be cold or they needed this as a costume, but it's July and it's hot as blazes. But they decided to wear these long woolen coats. And they didn't want to walk on the road because they figured it'd be too visible. And so here's these two goofballs, like kind of walking like this, trying to sneak through the pasture. And somebody's looking out their window like, what in the world is this? They got to the railroad tracks. There was boxcars sitting there that weren't moving, but they stood inside one of the boxcars pressed up against the wall and didn't think anybody was going to find them. So I think it took about 30 minutes to bring them in. That's about as successful as they all ever were. Let's take a couple more questions and then we can wrap this thing up. Yes, sir.
Did they have to keep the Austrian POWs separate from the Germans? Because I know they didn't get along.
So the question was separating nationalities like Austrians and Germans. They for sure kept the Germans and the Italians separated. A lot of times there was mixing in nationalities because the Germans would basically press anybody into service. There was all sorts of nationalities there. And it wasn't a large enough group on a wholesale basis to make like specific camps for the Austrians, but if there were personality problems, they would solve that in one way or another. All right, we'll take two more. So if you got them or you got a good story to tell, any personal connections to the camps, where am I looking here? Okay, I see one and I see two. So we'll take these, and if they talk for an hour, we won't take any more questions. If it's short, we might have time for one more.
No, just a question. Once this site was chosen, how long did it take to construct all of these buildings, and who did the construction, who did the building?
So the question was, once the site was selected, how long did it take the buildings, to build the buildings, and who actually did the construction? Hold on a second here. I got to look this up real quick. I don't know offhand. I don't mean to be lighthearted. I think it is in the book, but it was fast and it was busy because I think the land was being acquired, you know, in 1942, and they were here by early 1943. And you know, there were a number of government contractors. You know, I've seen drawings of the camp itself. I don't know if it was a mix of government and civilian workers, but they just got a lot done in a hurry. And it's, to my mind, that's a pretty interesting portion of the book where they talk about the construction schedule and the work that they did to get it done that fast.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
She asked my question.
Oh, okay. That question was going to be about camp construction.
You mentioned earlier about the enlistment. How were the officers treated?
Okay, the question was enlisted men and treatment of them compared to officers. So, as you likely know, there's sort of three levels of soldiers. There's regular enlisted, like privates and corporals. There's non-commissioned officers who are all the sergeants. And then there's officers who are that third group. So the officers were generally housed in their own camps. They could not be required to work, but they could volunteer if they wanted to. early on, again, when the program was just getting started, it was both officers and enlisted among the Italian population. And the officers were happy for the chance to go to work because it gave them something to do. And instead of being, in Weingarten where they had been the whole time in one of these big camps, they got to go to places like Columbia and work and, at least see stuff and do things. But there was segregation between the officers and enlisted, and they maintained the military structure where, the camp commander would say, we need 30 people to go out and work tomorrow. Sergeant so-and-so, you pick them in, they're going to work. So they maintained their own internal military hierarchy. Okay. All right. We'll wind this thing up. I see a hand here, and I see a hand here, and we'll call that an evening.
What happened to the prisoners of war that died here?
Okay, that's a very good question. What happened to the prisoners of war who died here? There were some number of prisoners who died either through illness or lingering maladies from the battlefield. There was a cemetery at Weingarten where they buried the Italian prisoners of war. And there are photos of that in the book. I had the chance to walk around in the property, and the graves are gone. They were disinterred, if that's the right word for it. The bodies were dug up and returned to Europe, but you can still see kind of sunken places where the actual graves were. There was kind of a circle drive with a raised thing in the middle. If you can picture, it's like something a flagpole would be on where you go in a circle around it. You can still see where the graves were. So as prisoners died here, they were buried here until they could be returned to family members. In some cases, if they couldn't identify living family members, they stayed in the United States. If you go to Jefferson Barracks, there are 5 German graves and 3 Italians right together in one part of the cemetery. So they did everything possible to return them to their families, but in some cases they are still here at rest. And it was kind of cool. I had a chance to visit those graves. It was an interesting experience.
No, I just wanted to reiterate how well they did have here. Our dad had to work on the farm in the woods, and we asked him, was he worried? He said they had a guard with them, but they had it made. And I never thought about it, and of course, the people in the rural areas in America never had nothing. They sacrificed everything. So I could imagine a lot of people were bitter because they, like our dad said, they were better off than we were.
Yes.
And in addition, a married couple lived in our summer house, and they took pictures of Carol as an infant, and that's why we have so many pictures of Carol.
Oh, is that right? Okay. Yeah.
She was a beautiful child.
Thank you. But yeah, we used to play up on that area as kids.
Yeah.
And there's still some concrete block walls there yet too. It's neat.
So thank you all so much for being here tonight. Yeah, sure. So I want to thank you for being here. Again, this is a wonderful project for me, and I've really enjoyed having the chance to speak with you tonight. I appreciate all the comments and the questions. Steph, are there any closing announcements?
Well, yes, we definitely want to thank you for visiting us tonight. Thank you so much. Can you believe he knows all that off the top of his head? Not one note. Fantastic. So thank you so much. He still has a few books here. I'm sure he'll stick around to sign them. And we certainly want to thank Dick Reminger for allowing us to use his facility here. And most of all, our sponsor for tonight's program, Southbound Fuel, Bob and Denise Grieshaber. Thank you so much. Without your help, we couldn't put these programs on. Before you leave, if you're interested, we're selling those raffle tickets where your kids could be the hit of the classroom back by the door. So if you're interested. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for your patience in having the new locations.